and welcome to today's broadcast on Cloud FinOps Unit Economics brought to you by Insight and Microsoft. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured and our speakers will answer throughout the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I would now like to turn over this presentation to our speakers, Marcus and Jeff. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Abby, and welcome once again, Jeff. It's great having you once again to present on FinOps to our customer group. I'm Marcus Benson. I'm our National Principal Architect for Cloud FinOps at Insight. And Jeff, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, and always a pleasure presenting with you. My name is Jeff Amels. My current title is a Cloud Financial Architect, reporting up into Microsoft Canada. Though my role is going to be changing over the next couple of weeks, I'm actually shifting into a business value assessment type of role, which plays really well into today's subject in and around FinOps and how we create KPIs and also look at unit-based economics as it's mapped to it. So super excited about the discussion today. And again, Marcus, always a pleasure presenting with you.
Likewise, Jeff. So today, our agenda, we're going to talk about, just as Jeff mentioned, really focusing in on KPIs and unit economics as it relates to FinOps in cloud management. So we're going to talk a little bit about, why it's important to set FinOps KPIs, objectives, selecting the right KPIs for your business and for your goals. We're going to talk through some common FinOps KPIs that we see that are broken out by, finance focused, IT, technology focused, and some specific KPIs around optimization. And then we'll talk through unit economics and business KPIs. Briefly discuss how to implement, track, and review your KPIs. And then we'll close out and discuss next steps in areas that you can go to discover more information and become more mature in this area. So why set FinOps KPIs? There's a couple of quotes here that I like, very, very similar quotes from a few different folks here. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So if you don't have KPIs, if you don't have a way to meaningfully measure your impact and your spend, you're going to have a really difficult time improving that spend and managing that spend ongoing. And the reason is FinOps is extremely complex. Cloud billing data currently lacks context. Typically, when you get your cloud bill, you're getting a Excel spreadsheet and exports out of, the billing provider or the billing console that could potentially be millions of line items broken out at a very, very granular level. So it's very difficult to make sense of that without having the right context around that data. Cloud is a variable cost model. It's difficult to predict. There's typically shared resources and shared environments that need to be split. On-demand provisioning, anyone can go out and create resources. And there's a lot of siloed data sets in the cloud too. So KPIs and unit economics can help bring context to that data and clarity to help with strategic decision-making, better forecasting and budgeting, optimization efforts and automation, help with overall financial performance, profitability, and help drive the right culture throughout your organization with that additional visibility and context.
And a quick comment on how to think about KPIs over time, as well as we use the analogy in several of our sessions about when we're adopting FinOps or we're changing culture or processes or workflows, that it kind of feels like we're being told to eat the whole elephant. It feels so overwhelming that there's so much context and complexities. But certainly as you look at your KPIs, start incrementally, and we'll talk through like some of the examples throughout the presentation, and then grow or mature those KPIs over time so they're more impactful. Certainly take that incremental step approach the same way the FinOps Foundation views maturity levels in different capability areas of those crawl, walk, run type of scenarios. Think about that in context of these KPIs, of these measures of success over time.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. As you mature, as your capabilities mature in the cloud, those KPIs and those metrics and what you're actually using to track your success is going to change along with that maturity. And so FinOps KPIs are going to matter to different personas. If you're a FinOps practitioner, obviously you're driving the evangelization of KPIs and unit economics to the various business units, engineering teams, financial resources that you're supporting as that FinOps practitioner. So you're really focused on educating how to actually create the right metrics, ensure that KPIs are interpreted correctly, and ensure that folks have visibility into that KPI over time. The C-suite is going to care about understanding the value of additional cloud spend, the value of cloud to the organization, and help make more informed, data-driven decisions based on those KPIs and those metrics. Business owners are really going to care about, again, business outcomes. So how do you track cloud cost efficiency across your product portfolio? How do you track profitability for different products that you are supporting in the cloud? These are things that a business owner is going to care about. Whereas engineering teams are going to be caring about more around optimization metrics, quantifying cost or usage impact when they scale with seasonality, reporting on cost efficiency over time, planning capacity requirements, making sure automation is there for cost efficiency, and making sure you have the means to actually measure and track the efficiency of your usage. And then IT finance and procurement is really going to care more around traditional finance activities like forecasting, budgeting, reporting, monitoring, facilitating more responsible cloud spend over time, managing different pricing discount programs with your providers.
And as we also look at these different roles, you can imagine, and even my brain gets thinking in around, well, where do we get some of these data sets? Like, for example, the FinOps role, as well as some of the engineering and some IT finance and procurement may pull from the native billing and usage type data sets of the cloud providers. While the C-suite may require some additional data sets, like internal budgetary databases or even revenue stream type of backends. So what we're also thinking about what we present into these roles, because each one wants different depths of analysis and around spend and also the business value impact of what that spend influences. It's also always good to think about, well, where do we get these data sets and how do we pull that together?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that brings up a point that we already, mentioned right at, at the beginning of this conversation, is that cloud data is very siloed today. And, having access to billing data is one thing, but if you want to bring that context into it, you may need additional data sets from the business, maybe a CMDB. Maybe there's, a product line that the business is supporting that, has seasonality, and they need to be able to monitor that over time. There's different things that are going to matter depending on, again, what persona you are.
Yeah.
So how do you create the right KPIs? What are the things that you need to kind of cover at the start, and as far as the right objectives, success factors, et cetera? Well, you first need to identify your sponsors and your stakeholders. That's the first step. Once you've identified your sponsors and your stakeholders, you then need to have those discussions with those sponsors to understand the objectives across all of, again, those different personas. Understand what the factors of success are going to be. What are the KPIs that you want to monitor? What are the metrics that are actually going to drive the measures and the reporting of those KPIs? There's no one metric to rule them all. Every metric, every KPI should always serve a purpose Otherwise, it's really a waste of time and effort to develop that, report on that. Metrics need to relate to the persona. They should be defined in collaboration with the different teams that they affect. And they should be maintained really by that central FinOps team with the feedback and input of those different personas and teams. And KPI should always drive in action. So if you're setting a KPI for things like reservation coverage, for example, and your KPI is 80% coverage, when that number gets below 80%, that should trigger an action to go out and buy more RIs to increase that coverage back up to the acceptable number or measure that you've set. So KPIs need to validate the strategic vision and the decisions taken. They need to guide the activities to achieve the objectives that you set. They need to justify actions being taken with data and with factual evidence, and they really should be driving correction of any anomalies detected. Again, so really they should be driving some kind of action based on that.
Oh, and Marcus, to put you a little bit on the spot, I'll share a little bit of my experience as well. As we create these KPIs and they justify some sort of actions back to like a business unit or a technical architect team with a business application to instill a change because we see an opportunity to reduce cash flow or something along those lines based on the KPIs. One of the big questions I get from customers is how frequently should we do this? Is it going to be a daily activity or a monthly or quarterly? My typical response is I see different industry verticals and different frequencies, meaning if a customer is going through migration, they do it even on a daily basis with some of the KPIs to make sure that they're on track. Versus like a C-level or CFO, CTO type of deliverable, or it may be per quarter. Was just curious about some of your experience.
No, I think that's a great question, and I think that's going to differ depending on the persona. So as you mentioned, C-suite, they're not going to have as much time to be looking at these KPIs and these trends on a daily basis. It's more than likely going to be at a monthly, maybe quarterly, or even sometimes annual basis for those C-levels. When you're actually talking about the business owners and the engineering teams, I mean, we really want to be pushing to the point where, they're making that a daily habit.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be the most proactive way to address anomalies and, anything that's not meeting those KPIs today.
Excellent.
And I think it depends on the size of your FinOps team as well. Do you have a dedicated FinOps team? Do you have a dedicated person that's doing this? Or is it just a part-time role for someone? That will also dictate, how much time is going to be spent creating and looking at these KPIs.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk through a few of the common FinOps KPIs that we see today across our customers. So these ones are more financial focused, but common KPIs that we see for FinOps teams around, finance is forecasting versus actuals variance percentage. So what's the acceptable variance percentage that you can stomach as an organization when it comes to forecasting versus your actuals? Obviously, as you get more mature, you should be trying to close that gap and decrease that variance amount. As you get better about forecasting new workloads, as you get better at, historic trending of your spend, et cetera. So that is one that we see quite a bit. Typically, a pretty common KPI we see is around 80% forecast versus actuals. So about a 20% variance or a 15% variance is acceptable. Cloud spend versus revenue. Especially if you are a cloud native organization or if you're an organization that has products that you provide to customers that are built in the cloud, that's very important. That's, really your cost of goods sold. That's your profitability. Cloud spend versus budget, making sure that you're able to predict what that spend is going to be for the next year and making sure that you're able to stay within those budgets That's especially important in government agencies, for example, that have hard budgets that are set, that they really need to stay within that number. Cloud spend as a percentage of total IT spend. Maybe you have a goal to move entirely to the cloud. And if so, cloud spend as a percentage of total IT spend is a great way to track that progress over time. Cloud spend versus on-premise IT spend. Again, similar objective with this KPI of being able to monitor what that mix is of cloud spend versus on-premise, and especially if you have goals to get out of the data center by a certain year or a certain date, it's a great KPI to set to track that progress.
And an additional point on these KPIs is also enabling yourselves to do trending over time. Are we getting better with the choices we're making with respect to forecast and actual variances, as well as mapping against potential revenue margins and your overall cloud spend? It's also equally critical when you look at cloud spend versus on-premise. If you're executing a migration, how is that trend looking over time? So it's not a spot instance of time type of KPI, but something that you want to measure at an incremental level.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's incredibly important to monitor it over time to see those trends, because that enables so much more from a FinOps standpoint around things like monthly business reviews with engineering teams. Yeah. When you can trend those KPIs over time, it allows you to have really intelligent, meaningful conversations with those different product teams where you can actually start doing benchmarking internally across different business units and see which teams are doing really well in certain areas, and have those teams present to the rest of the business units across the organization to share that knowledge and to share what they're doing. From an IT tech perspective, some common KPIs we see are things like cost per virtual machine, cost per core hour over time, cost per gigabyte of RAM over time, tagging coverage percentage, or things like cost per application. So again, all more technical focused, but all of these KPIs are really trying to show efficiency in a certain service or area over time. So for example, cost per core hour is one that I like to use frequently for tracking CPU optimization or VM optimization over time. If your cost per normalized compute hour over time is going up, there's probably an opportunity for you to go out and right size and or buy some reservations or savings plans to drive that per hour cost down and that rate down over time.
And the additional one I've seen is cost per like 10,000 transactions, for example.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, even in VMs or individual compute instances, they're hosting transactional stores, but they may modernize those to the PaaS level meters, those platform as a service meters, those cloud native transactional stores. So the KPI shifts a little bit over time. We use that previous perspective from the FinOps foundation of that crawl, walk, run. That's where you may be starting with a very compute instance KPI metric, like the cost per VM, but you move that transactional store to a hosted instance of a SQL managed instance, for example, and your measurement, your KPI kind of changes to numbers of transactions per dollar over time. Which is great because that's starting to map towards some of the business-based KPIs.
Yeah, and I can give you a real-world example of that. We were working with one company that was really starting to modernize, and their objective was to modernize their workloads. They were really, lift and shift focused for quite some time, so they have a ton of VMs. What they did is they set a KPI initially to look at, this was an AWS customer, to look at EC2 as a percentage of their total spend. And their goal was to drive that percentage down over time as they modernize their workloads and get out of virtual machines. Eventually, that KPI matured to an IaaS versus PaaS percentage in breakdown, where they actually went through and mapped out all of their services and categorized them into IaaS, PaaS, et cetera, so they could actually track that at a more granular level than just EC2 as a percentage. So as you mature, as you get better, you're going to start to fine tune these KPIs.
Great example.
Yeah. And actually that example is right here on the screen. So optimization focused KPIs. I've mentioned this one already, but on-demand usage as a percentage versus commitment-based purchases versus RIs, savings plans, spot instances. Idle resource percentage, making sure that you're identifying orphaned resources and tracking that as a percentage of your total resource count over time. And maybe there's an acceptable threshold of 1 or 2% or 3% of resources, but once you hit that point, that triggers a cleanup action to go out and delete those orphaned resources. IaaS spend as a percentage versus PaaS or cloud native. Once again, if you have modernization goals or efforts, that's a great way to start to track that. Normalized cost per virtual machine usage hour over time. Again, that's that way to track your optimization efforts for virtual machine usage over time. Normalized cost per gigabyte stored over time tracks your ability to, utilize data lifecycle management effectively for your storage in the cloud. Okay, so those are all great KPIs and very useful, but really the most important KPIs that you can set as an organization are going to be business KPIs and unit economics. And the reason is, this is the best way to actually track your success as a business to those goals. Some common business related KPIs could be cost per $1 million in revenue. Cost of goods sold if you are a cloud native product centric organization, cost per monthly active user, cost per transactions, cost in revenue per whatever metric that is, profit margin per customer. If you're an electronics manufacturer, maybe it's spend versus monthly active devices, average spend per engagement hour on the device. Financial services companies, maybe it's cost per analyzed financial transaction. But to use the example for the electronics manufacturer, average spend per engagement hour on device is a great way to trend and see how seasonality affects your business. If you have an electronic device that is going to be selling a lot of units over Christmas time, maybe you want to understand how your cloud spend is affected by that after that Christmas time, after that Christmas period, and everyone opens these new devices, logs onto this network. How is that going to affect your spend? So being able to predict that from a seasonality perspective is very, very useful.
Yeah, certainly in scenarios. Oh, sorry. Certainly in scenarios like that, you want to be able to have that consistent revenue margin. You might look at options of using like scale sets or some sort of more dynamic application architecture that, to Marcus's point, is measurable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for a professional services company like Insight, for example, cost per client engagement, cost per acquired customer during a marketing campaign. For a SaaS company, spend per customer, the cost of goods sold for every customer that is hosted on the platform, cost per release. Those are all, different business metrics that, really can tell a much better story around your success as an organization with using cloud than looking at just straight spending. So how do you start actually implementing KPIs in your organization? Well, again, every KPI that you create needs to serve a purpose. Otherwise, it's a waste of time and money setting up the framework, the metrics, the measures, the reporting, and creates more noise for the end user. So again, every KPI needs to have an objective. And there's an example here on this slide here over on the right. This is actually a real world example from a customer we were working with, and this is how they created their KPI dashboard. They broke it out very, very clearly of what the objective of the KPI is, what the KPI is, an explanation of what they expect, and a goal over time. So again, this is a great example of, a great way of rolling out a KPI with, again, specific objectives, specific information, explanations, and goals around why you're reporting on it.
And kind of a sneaky trick that I leverage with customers is I go out and read and listen to their quarterly earnings reports, especially for publicly traded companies, and look at, well, what measures are they talking about within these discussions about their earnings and revenues, especially for cloud native type of companies that I work with. So I could get an understanding of, well, if we start with like some of the technical KPIs and some of the measure or optimization KPIs, how do they then map to the higher level business value based KPIs? And how do we map those directly to statements that are even being made in quarterly calls? And we tend, as we work for large corporations, we tend to miss listening to our own quarterly calls, but it's super helpful to get that level of insight as it bubbles up to those C-level and even investor discussions, especially for publicly traded companies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Obviously, creating the KPI is just, part of the battle. Creating the reporting is great, but if you're not actually integrating this information into your ongoing activities, you're still going to struggle with adoption. So this KPI, these KPIs you set, really need to be reviewed on an ongoing basis. So integrate this into, an ongoing monthly business review with your cost center teams, for example, or at the very least, look at it from an organizational perspective and look at different business units and how they are all performing against those KPIs, because that gives you a good target list of which business units need help in different areas. And as a FinOps team, really your job is enablement to those business units. So that gives you a really good target list and helps you as a FinOps practitioner do your job better. So benefits of successful KPI management, if you roll out KPIs and you do it well, it makes it easier to establish efficiency targets, like reducing compute costs by, X%, increasing revenue per dollar of cloud spend by Y%, improving margins by Z% by adopting cloud native models. Additional benefits to a FinOps practice, well, it helps you quantify the impact of seasonality on cloud spend, improve forecasting, improve COGS data for pricing, helps you establish some standards for measurement, for benchmarking internal products and teams against each other, helps to distinguish those changes due to architectural changes. If you're going through that modernization effort, again, how do you quantify that and see that change financially? Well, KPIs are a great way to do that. And it also helps you identify the right optimization levers for each business unit that you're supporting as a FinOps practitioner. Okay. So when should you introduce KPIs? Well, you should introduce KPIs as soon as you introduce FinOps. Again, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, you can't manage it. And the goal of a FinOps team is to improve efficiency from a cloud perspective and a cost perspective. So you really need to start thinking about this right away. The first step to rolling out FinOps is identifying your stakeholders, pain points, advocates, et cetera, creating that initial plan. But then the next step is suggest those first KPIs. So once you know what the pain points are, what the goals are, initial resourcing, then you start to look at, all right, what are the KPIs and measurements that we're going to use to really show if we're successful, if we're improving over time. So then you present those KPIs to that stakeholder community, drive agreement on that operating model, create those initial sets of KPIs. But as Jeff was saying earlier in the call, you do need to have that maturity model. So create a roadmap, create future KPIs that maybe you don't have the ability to report on today, but you want to get to that point. And then, continue to evolve those KPIs, get feedback on those KPIs, and improve those over time.
And as Marcus mentioned, you can't start early enough in this process. I see a lot of customers focused on, well, let's create a business case of cloud migration with some high-level measures. And those may be very CFO-specific measures like net present value or ROI, which are measurable, yes, over time as you execute a migration. But some of the KPIs that Marcus mentioned during this discussion are measurable in a smaller increment of time to make sure that you are on track, that you are being successful. And it influences even how your procurement group negotiates contracts with cloud providers that have the most impact, those concessions or discounts or investments that will most influence or be helpful for the business over time. As you create those KPIs early in the process. A lot of times I'm pushing customers to not just create that static business case, but these FinOps KPIs very early on, even before they consume their first cloud meter, so they know what they're working toward.
Absolutely. And it's important to reinforce change. With anything around FinOps, it's very much a cultural shift. There is a people aspect to it that needs to be accounted for. So organizational change management, one of the founding principles is reinforcing that change. So make sure after you roll out those KPIs that you're collecting feedback, you're analyzing those metrics, those KPIs over time to make sure they're still viable, that you're updating and correcting anything that needs to be corrected, and that you're working through that adoption and sustainment effort. Because again, if you're not integrating this into your monthly business reviews, your monthly processes, and making this a habit for those engineering teams to review, they're just your reports aren't going to get utilized, unfortunately. So there is a people aspect that needs to be accounted for.
Excellent. And one thing I do want to mention, because it's a big move by the FinOps Foundation, is they published FOCUS. It stands for FinOps Open Cost and Usage Specification. Yep. Now, this is kind of a nerdy subject because we're talking about data schemas and column names and those type of aspects. But I wanted to mention it because this does still feel like we're eating the whole elephant. It's a lot of complexity that we have to consume and generate reports to these different roles. But there are great activities and discussions happening within the foundation to make this easier and more intuitive over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for that, Jeff. There's also another thing I want to mention too with regards to the FinOps Foundation, specifically around KPIs. They actually just announced on their last summit call a few weeks ago that the working group for KPIs and unit economics has released their first version or first iteration of the KPI library. So if you actually go to FinOps.org and you go to the KPI capability, you'll actually have a full list and a full library of common KPIs that other FinOps practitioners are implementing, what the actual formulas are behind those KPIs so that you can implement them in your organization as well.
Excellent. Yeah, it's always great to not have to start from scratch. So.
Exactly. Well, I think that concludes our topic for today. So again, Jeff, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure presenting alongside of you. And if anyone has any questions on anything that they've heard today, please put those questions in the chat, and we would love to answer those for you. So thanks again, and appreciate everyone's time.
Yeah, absolutely my pleasure as well. Thank you, Marcus.